Doran 7 was the kind of world humanity had only dreamed of a century ago. The twin suns bathed the amber grasslands in a warm, perpetual glow, and the air, slightly laced with oxygen from genetically engineered foliage, smelled faintly of cinnamon and copper. It was the fourth successful terraforming project in the outer reaches of Sector Theta, and it had already become a model colony for interstellar expansion. Life on Doran 7 was peaceful, productive, and filled with promise. Dr. Elena Rivera stood outside the Biodome lab, squinting up at the pale sky as a transport drone flew overhead. She was the lead botanist on the project, a woman in her mid-40s with silver-streaked hair and a sharp, analytical mind. Her team had just stabilized the final batch of bio-native crops, something no colony had accomplished this quickly before. Her assistant, Mark Talon, a soft-spoken engineer barely into his 30s, jogged up to her with the usual excitement in his voice. He waved a data tablet and pointed at the output graphs, grinning like a boy who'd just won a science fair. Photosynthesis rates are up by 12%, he announced. I think we just made spinach that thrives on ultraviolet radiation, Elena chuckled. Maybe we'll finally have something green that doesn't taste like plastic. This kind of banter was common among the colonists. They were scientists, engineers, families, and builders. Pioneers, not soldiers. There were no weapons on Dorn 7, not even a security drone with a stun setting. They had no reason to expect hostility. The Galactic Compact had granted humanity full colonization rights over the Theta sector following 3 years of diplomatic negotiation. There was no record of native intelligent life on Dorn 7, no known territorial disputes. Then came the signal. It arrived in the early morning hours, a burst of encrypted communication intercepted by the colony's orbital relay. The message contained no language, only a long, rhythmic pulse accompanied by frequencies known to induce nausea and disorientation in most humanoid species. It knocked out communications for 6 hours, disrupting everything from drone coordination to life support diagnostics. Alina woke to a red emergency light spinning above her bed, her ears ringing. By the time she got to the command center, 3 satellites had gone dark. She found Commander Davis slumped over a console, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He looked up at her, dazed. "They're here," he whispered, and then passed out. No one on Doran 7 had ever heard of the Xalari. Their ships appeared first as distant shadows against the morning sky. Sleek, needle-like cruisers with hulls that shimmered like oil on water. They descended in silence, bypassing orbital defenses as though those systems didn't even exist. The first strike came within minutes. The main power core at Station 3 exploded in a fireball that turned the horizon into a jagged blaze. People screamed. Alarms howled. The colony had no military personnel, no defense protocols. Mark grabbed Elena by the arm and pulled her behind the hydroponic tanks, both of them ducking as shockwaves shattered the lab's outer windows. The Xalari troops landed moments later. Their exosuits were bone white, segmented like insect armor, and they moved with a fluidity that suggested more machine than flesh. Each soldier carried a plasma lance pulsing with cold blue energy. They spoke no words. They didn't issue commands. They simply marched through the colony and executed any human they encountered. 12 humans were chosen, randomly it seemed, 6 women, 6 men, scientists, medics, one 16-year-old girl who had been working in the gardens. The Xalari dragged them into the colony square, forced the others to watch as they kneeled in the dust. A large hovercam hovered over the scene, transmitting live across galactic communication channels. A tall Xalari commander, distinguishable by a crimson crest etched into her helmet, stepped forward. Without emotion, she raised her hand. One by one, the humans were executed. A plasma lance through the chest, a beam of light that disintegrated the body in seconds. Elena watched as Mark collapsed beside her, unable to look anymore, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The 16-year-old girl's name was Lydia. Elena had helped her plant her first soil batch just 2 weeks earlier. The massacre lasted less than 4 minutes. Afterward, the Xalari left, just like that. Their ships rose into the sky, vanishing beyond the clouds without explanation, without demand. They left the colony in flames, communication systems in ruin, and the survivors paralyzed with grief and rage. Medical drones arrived far too late to help. The broadcast remained live for hours until the relay rebooted and reconnected with the nearest Federation outpost. Earth received the footage. President Alan Roth sat in the United Earth Federation command chamber in Geneva when the transmission arrived. The room fell into a stunned silence as the video played 12 peaceful citizens executed like animals. There were no weapons on them, no threats posed. The council had granted the colony's charter. Everything had been done by the book. Alan clenched his fists as he watched Lydia fall to the ground, her hands still stained with soil. He turned to his military advisor, General Kenna Price, and asked in a low, unshaking voice, "How fast can we reach Doran 7? Kenna didn't hesitate. "We can mobilize in 48 hours. 2 fleets are within 6 days' jump." Alan stood. "Then we strike." In the following days, mourning gave way to fury. Across Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies, citizens wept at first, then demanded retribution. Justice for the 12 became a rallying cry, carved into walls and burned into digital billboards. Soldiers re-enlisted, civilians volunteered, even pacifist leaders could not deny what had occurred. The Zalari had not attacked a military target. They had not issued warnings or engaged in diplomacy. They had simply executed civilians. And humanity remembered. In centuries past, humanity had waged wars so brutal that entire nations ceased to exist. Civilizations had risen and crumbled in the fires of vengeance. But those days were thought to be gone, left behind with Earth's history books. Now, looking into the void of space once more, humanity remembered what it meant to lose everything, and how far it would go to make sure that never happened again. Doran 7 had been peaceful, now it was a grave, and from that grave, the war would begin. The war declaration was not ceremonious. It did not begin with a broadcast or a grand announcement to the Galactic Council. It started with silence, an electric, coiled silence that fell across Earth's military command networks as hundreds of officers awaited orders. General Kenna Price stood at the center of the war room aboard the U.S. Oberon, her uniform crisp, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display of the Theta Sector. Her fingers danced over the interface, rerouting supply chains, greenlighting fleet trajectories, and authorizing full military mobilization across 5 human-controlled systems. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. The President had spoken. Within hours, 24 human battlecruisers were en route to staging points near Doran 7 shipyards. Once running at half capacity, burst into round-the-clock operation. The UEF war machine, dormant for nearly 30 years, came alive with a hunger that hadn't been seen since the asteroid belt rebellions. The factories of Luna, the orbital rings of Titan, and the defense silos of Callisto burned with light as plasma cores were assembled, mech suits calibrated, and AI battle nets updated with the latest field protocols. Earth didn't weep anymore. Earth prepared. In the deep void between systems, Admiral Cyrus Vale reviewed the encrypted intelligence files from his command seat aboard the Icarus Ascendancy. His face, pale and angular, was made harsher by the holographic glare of the screen before him. He studied the Zalari's military structures, war tactics, known species biology. Though most of the data was outdated, incomplete, or purely speculative, the Zalari were elusive, not members of the Galactic Compact, not frequenting trade routes, and never before engaged in formal war with any major species. Their incursions, while occasionally brutal, had been small, strategic, and short-lived. Doran 7, however, had been an open slaughter. "Admiral," spoke Commander Alin Sato, her voice calm but clipped. "Fleet readiness is at 87%. Strike units 1 through 5 are in final simulation drills. We're projecting combat arrival at Zalari border space in 5 days, 16 hours. Cyrus nodded once, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched the 3-dimensional model of a Zalari battlecruiser rotating slowly on the display, the iridescent hull catching simulated light. No one had ever captured one intact. No communication protocols had been decoded. Whatever language the Zalari used, it was not derived from any known linguistic root. Cyrus leaned forward, zoomed into the aft sections of the cruiser, and highlighted weak points based on assumed plasma core emissions. The moment the fleet entered range, there would be no diplomacy. Humanity had no more use for words. Back on Earth, President Alan Roth convened with the Core Strategy Board. The chamber was buried beneath Geneva, layered with shielding that could withstand orbital bombardment. Alan stood at the head of a long obsidian table, surrounded by advisors, intelligence directors, and military leaders. He was not a man of theatrics. His strength lay in clarity, in unshakable conviction. He reviewed the latest psychological warfare plans, the networked propaganda packages prepared to rally public support, and the contingency protocols for civilian defense in case of retaliation. "We're not just going to war," Allen said as he closed the final briefing document. "We're going to make sure this never happens again. Not to us, not to anyone." General Price nodded. "Then we don't stop at retribution. We erase their ability to recover." Across the galaxy, other species watched and whispered. The Galactic Council, stunned into paralysis, issued no statements. Dozens of non-human diplomats sent private messages to Earth, some offering condolences, others urging restraint. No reply was given. The humans had gone quiet in a way that made the galaxy nervous. Their history books were filled with examples of what followed such silence. In the Polaris system, a young ensign named Jonah Reese boarded the Dauntless Wind for his first deployment. He had grown up after the war era, fed on stories of peacekeeping missions and colonial growth. When he told his mother that he had been assigned to the strike fleet, she cried. Not because he was going to war, but because she had seen the Doran 7 footage. She didn't speak of justice. She spoke of fire. The Dauntless Wind carried 12,000 personnel, from fighter pilots to cybertechs to ground deployment squads. In one of the lower barracks, Corporal Natasha Vire prepped her exosuit, running calibration checks on the hydraulic limbs and thermal shielding. She was a veteran of pirate suppression campaigns in the rim sectors, but she had never seen full-scale war. She looked at the mission briefing on her wrist tablet, deployment targets, city layouts, projected resistance clusters, and she understood this would not be a battle. It would be an extermination. In orbit around Ceres, the UEF launched the Silent Judgment, a ship unlike any other. It carried no personnel, no fighters, no broadcast antennae. Its hull was black as void, designed to absorb all light. It housed the most advanced AI strike system ever developed, Project Alecto. The AI's core directive was singular: identify Zalari command structures and eliminate them through orbital precision strikes before human forces ever reached the ground. The ship was given no override codes. Once launched, it would obey only its programming. As the days passed, the staging fleets grew. Civilian traffic in the Theta sector ceased. Trade routes were rerouted. Diplomatic channels became eerily quiet, and the gravitational wave sensors of nearby systems picked up the echoes of massive fleet movement. Earth wasn't just bringing warships. It was bringing carriers, automated mining rigs for battlefield salvage, mobile medical bays, and data absorption drones to collect every possible scrap of information from every scorched Yalari world. A new initiative, codenamed Ashlight, was greenlit by Earth's Central Defense Intelligence. The goal was not just retaliation. It was the complete mapping and eventual dismantling of the entire Zalari civilization. Using data from the attack on Doran 7 and trace signals recovered from the orbital relay, human intelligence operatives triangulated potential points of origin. Spy satellites were deployed. Infiltration probes cloaked in debris fields were launched into the void. The Zalari had opened a door they thought humanity would be too weak to walk through. Instead, humanity built a gate and walked through it with an army. At the edge of Zellery-controlled space, the first human fleet exited warp in perfect formation. Admiral Vale stood on the bridge of the Icarus Ascendancy, hands clasped behind his back as the stars reoriented themselves outside the viewing window. Before him stretched a region of space devoid of known starports or trade routes. The void felt unnatural, as though reality bent differently in this sector. His communications officer nodded. "All ships in position. Signal confirmed from command. We await your word." Cyrus didn't hesitate. "Deploy reconnaissance units. Prep attack pattern Vortex 9. No warnings, no demands. We strike at the heart." The orders spread like wildfire across the comm net. Engines roared to life. Fighters detached from hangars like swarms of silver insects. Plasma turrets locked into position. The humans came not to negotiate, not to posture, but to burn. And in every heart aboard those ships, from the admirals to the youngest mechanics, the memory of the 12 remained. It was not revenge, it was reckoning. The first Zalari planet to fall was designated by human intelligence as MX-471, though its native name remained unknown. The world was mineral-rich, its crust laced with rare elements and crystalline structures that pulsed faintly in the dark. No stars lit the sky, only the dim glow of a red giant in the far distance, barely enough to illuminate the jagged cliffs and obsidian plains that stretched for thousands of kilometers. It was a place built for survival, not beauty, the perfect training ground for a species born of war. And yet, when the human fleet descended, there was no resistance. Admiral Cyrus Vale stood unmoving on the bridge of the Icarus Ascendancy, eyes locked onto the sensor display. He watched as 26 human warships entered low orbit, their weapons armed, their shields resonating with defensive pulses. He issued the command to deploy drones. Hundreds of autonomous scouts burst from the launch bays, scanning the surface for heat signatures, energy readings, anything resembling a defense system. What returned was silence. Dead buildings, unpowered bunkers, decaying infrastructure. The Zelarai had evacuated. Commander Elin Sato, standing beside Cyrus, narrowed her eyes. "This isn't a retreat," she said. "It's a lure." Cyrus didn't answer immediately. He zoomed the display onto one of the cities below. Towering spires of black alloy, scorched and hollowed out, some still smoldering. "Send ground teams, full armor, load Phase 3 protocols. Assume the planet is rigged." Within 20 minutes, drop pods streaked through the atmosphere like falling stars. Each pod carried a squad of mechanized infantry, soldiers encased in kinetic armor suits, equipped with neural uplinks and shoulder-mount pulse cannons. One of the squads, led by Captain Ren Maddox, made first contact with the ruins. Ren moved cautiously through the shattered streets, scanning for motion, while her squad fanned out in tight formation. She had seen war before, mutiny skirmishes on Saturn's moons, but nothing felt like this. The air was too still, the buildings too intact. Her second-in-command, Corporal Zaid Mercer, approached the shell of a Zalari transport unit. He ran a scan over its chassis. "Power core's been removed, intentionally stripped. Nothing here is left to salvage." Ren didn't respond. Her focus was on a strange structure in the distance. An obelisk that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, the only source of energy for kilometers. She marked it for priority analysis and ordered her team to regroup. 3 kilometers away, another squad wasn't so lucky. Unit Theta 5 entered what appeared to be an administrative facility. Moments after breaching the main entrance, the building exploded from within, twin shockwaves ripping through the block and vaporizing 12 soldiers instantly. A dozen more were injured by falling debris and secondary detonations. The entire block had been mined with gravitic charges embedded beneath the foundation, designed to collapse the structure inward and incinerate anyone inside. On board the Icarus Ascendancy, Elin reported the loss to Cyrus with cold precision. He acknowledged it, but his attention was already on the new data coming from the AI scouts. Something deeper was embedded in the crust. Large structures, some biological, others mechanical, hidden silos, tunnels leading to underground chambers. The Chalari hadn't just fled. They had buried something. "Target all subcrust activity," Cyrus ordered. "Authorization for seismic disruption." Full sweep, the command spread through the fleet. Orbital bombers disengaged their safeties and aligned their trajectories. Within moments, the sky of MX-471 bloomed with artificial fire. Pulses of gravitic torpedoes struck the ground, sending tremors that cracked the planet's crust. Huge sections of the landscape collapsed, revealing the true scale of the Zalari infrastructure. Massive underground hives, black arteries of tunnels stretching for hundreds of kilometers, each one brimming with machinery long since deactivated. Then, from the darkness, something rose. It began with a screech, high-pitched, not mechanical, almost organic in its modulation. Dozens of dark forms emerged from the craters, fast-moving, multi-limbed constructs unlike anything seen in known galactic archives. Zalari war beasts, half-living, half-meaner entities, bred not for conquest but for eradication. Each towered at 4 meters, covered in carapace-like armor with plasma cores glowing at the joints. They didn't hesitate. They leapt into the air, propelled by internal boosters, and slammed into the human squad still on the ground. Captain Wren saw one land 50 meters from her position. It shrieked and lunged forward, skewering Private Harlow through the chest before flinging his lifeless body into the air. Wren screamed for her team to engage. Pulse rifles lit up the dark, their blue bolts hammering the creature's flank, but its armor deflected most of the shots. It took a direct hit from a shoulder cannon to bring it down. From orbit, Cyrus watched the chaos unfold. "Pull ground teams back, switch to orbital firepower." The retreat was brutal. Dozens of soldiers didn't make it to the extraction points. Some were torn apart, others lost in the collapsing tunnels. On board the Dauntless Wind, Lieutenant Jonah Reese tracked the extraction beacons as one after another blinked out. He felt helpless, sitting at a control station while his comrades screamed through comms, begging for evac, some cursing, others crying. It was his first taste of war, and it hit like acid in his veins. But humanity didn't falter. As the last transport ships rose from the surface, the orbital fleet shifted into annihilation mode. The Silent Judgment, now in position, activated its AI. Project Electo synchronized with the fleet's fire control, recalibrating all weapons to strike the exposed underground structures. The order was simple: leave no biological mass intact. The bombardment that followed was unmatched in human history. Plasma lances cracked the planet's core, hypervelocity rods punched through entire mountain ranges, kinetic disruptors turned oceans of liquid into vaporized clouds that hung like ghosts in the atmosphere. Every nest, every buried factory, every tunnel was reduced to dust. The surface of MX-471 became a blackened wasteland, glowing faintly with residual heat and scattered debris. No more screeches, no more movement. General Kenna Price received the report 12 minutes after the final impact. She read it once, then looked up from her console and whispered to herself, "One down." But the campaign was far from over. The data collected from MX-471 revealed a network of similar facilities across dozens of Zolari-controlled worlds. Each one was a node in a vast, semi-organic military web. Each one had the capacity to breed war beasts and operate autonomously. If humanity waited, if even one was allowed to regenerate, the entire war could tilt back into chaos. Cyrus knew this. As the Icarus Ascendancy turned toward the next set of coordinates, he stood silently at the forward deck, the planet shrinking behind him. He didn't feel triumph, only weight. The kind of weight that grows heavier with every battle, every casualty, every name added to the memorial logs. He didn't ask for glory. None of them did. This was no war for territory, no war for dominance. This was vengeance, weaponized, and vengeance had no need for rest. Admiral Cyrus Vale stood on the observation deck of the Icarus Ascendancy, eyes fixed on the swirling white new gas clouds of Nebula Theta 9. The Zolari homeworld lay just beyond the veil, a planet obscured for centuries by anomalous energy readings, cloaked in silence, hidden behind dense molecular fog that had resisted every known method of penetration. But now, after 3 months of relentless pursuit and scorched system annihilation, humanity had found it, the core of the Empire, the origin. He said nothing as the fleet moved into final position. Around him, the command crew worked with silent efficiency. No one spoke unless necessary. No one celebrated. The silence that had infected the Zolari campaign had seeped into the bones of the human fleet. It was no longer about victory. It was about completion, about closure, about erasing the question mark that hung over every life lost since Doran 7. From the war chamber aboard the Providence Warden, General Kenna Price coordinated the convergence of the 6 remaining strike fleets. Her voice was steady, her movements precise, but inside she felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. She had served in wars before. She had watched colonies fall, entire factions reduced to dust. But something about this operation, this final step, filled her with an unshakable sense of dread. She pushed it down. Feelings were not useful in the final hour. "Proceed with Operation Eclipse," she ordered. "Initiate full planetary scan." Dozens of scanning vessels launched from the flanks of the fleet, cutting through the nebula with high-density sensor pulses. The data returned in waves, fluctuating gravity wells, artificial tectonic structures, energy surges that spiked like heartbeats across the planet's crust. No orbital stations, no active fleet. But beneath the surface, movement, biological, massive. Admiral Lorraine Miles, commanding the Third Fleet, narrowed her eyes as she examined the life-form charts. "Millions," she murmured, more to herself than to her crew, still alive down there. General Price's voice came through the channel. "Engage planetary sterilization protocol. No exceptions, no hesitation." Admiral Vale hesitated for the first time. He looked at the growing display of life-form density, civilians, non-combatants, genetic markers indicating younglings, dormant genetic matrices, massive vaults containing Zolari embryos held in cryostasis. This wasn't a military base, this was a sanctuary, a cradle, perhaps even the last one. He tapped his console. "General, this is Vale." Confirming. Her response came without pause. "Confirmed. No survivors." "End it." He gave the order. The sky split. Superheated plasma rounds descended through the atmosphere, detonating deep beneath the crust. Shock waves rippled across the planet's surface, tearing apart biostructures, obliterating energy sources, crumbling towers of living metal that had stood for thousands of years. Firestorms swept through the equatorial forests. Craters swallowed cities whole. The ocean boiled. Within hours, the Zalyari homeworld was unrecognizable. In the underground vaults, the screams never reached space. There were no transmissions, no escape attempts. Those who remained simply accepted what had come. Captain Wren Maddox watched the inferno from the orbiting glass deck of the Steel Accord. Her armor was still scorched from her last ground mission, her helmet resting beside her. She said nothing. She didn't blink. She just stared, her eyes hollow as the planet burned beneath her. Lieutenant Jonah Reese sat alone in the crew quarters of the Dauntless Wind, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly. He had not spoken to anyone in days. He had tried to write a report, tried to put words to what he had felt when that Zalari voice pierced his mind on Tyraxis. But every time he tried, the words dissolved into nothing. Now, with the war ending, he no longer knew what to say, or if anything needed to be said at all. And aboard the Vigilant Crown, Admiral Lorraine Miles closed the file on her secret cultural dossier. There was nothing left to preserve, no temples, no scripts, no meaning. The civilization she had tried to understand was now vaporized, turned to ash and static. She opened a new log, stared at the blank entry for several minutes, and then closed it without writing anything. Back on Earth, President Alan Roth watched the final transmission with folded arms and a clenched jaw. The cabinet behind him erupted in whispers, some in relief, some in discomfort. He raised his hand, silencing them. "It's done," he said. "All of it." And it was. The Zalari were gone. Every known outpost, every facility, every archive, every vessel, tracked and destroyed. There were no captives, no survivors, no monuments left standing. The name would not pass into history because history required memory, and the galaxy would remember nothing. Humanity had turned a page not by writing a new chapter, but by burning the book. Public broadcasts across the colonies labeled it a triumph. Memorials were erected for the 12 lost on Doran 7. Streets were named in their honor. Statues were unveiled. Songs were written. Schoolchildren recited the names during unity ceremonies. But none of it felt like closure because something had changed. Humanity, once seen as diplomats, explorers, thinkers, had proven what it was capable of when pushed beyond the edge. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy trembled. No world dared challenge Earth now. No species spoke against the purge. Trade treaties were signed with trembling hands. Borders were redrawn without resistance. The United Earth Federation stood taller than ever before, but it was not pride that lingered. It was silence, not the Zalari's silence, humanity's. Admiral Cyrus Vale stood alone in the strategy chamber, reviewing the war's final report. His hands didn't shake, his mind didn't waver, but his eyes lingered too long on the casualty lists, the declassified images of the final bombardment, the thermal signatures of cradles incinerated at subsurface depths. He had carried out his orders, all of them, and for that he would be remembered as a war hero. But in the final line of his private log, encrypted and never transmitted, he wrote one sentence: "We became what we feared the most." Then he sealed the file and walked away.